Hello and welcome to Belfast Iconoclast. This week, I attended a panel discussion on corporation tax, hosted by Oxfam Ireland. The question being whether there was any justification for a lowered rate of tax in Northern Ireland.
Good evening, you're all very welcome to the MAC. Thanks so much for coming along. And we hope to be an interesting discussion and dialogue about what we describe as tax justice. I suppose particular welcome to Wanjiru and Kanyiha, who come from Kenya and Nigeria respectively, and to our panellists that will be introduced shortly by Yvette. And to all of you, it's great to see you here. This is an important area. I'm going to welcome our youngest participant. So I suppose you might ask, why is an organisation like Oxfam campaigning and talking about tax at all? When you think about, the work that we do in humanitarian response and development over long periods of time, working on women's rights, working on land issues and health and education and so on. But the truth of it is, as we have progressed over the last 15, 20 years particularly, and the world has made some progress in terms of development. And it's important to remember that, and despite what you might see and what we might read, and the crises that are around the world at the moment. Between the year 2000 and 2015, we reduced extreme poverty by 50%. And our ambition and the SDG target is to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. That's within sight. That's within everybody's lifetime in this room, I hope. So as we look towards that, we look to the fact that there is a real concern now that growing inequality in the world is actually going to slow down that rate of poverty eradication. Some of you may have seen our report recently in the last few weeks, which we've done over the last number of years around the Davos moment, the World Economic Forum, where now it's gotten to the situation where 8 men, and they are all men, in the world own the same amount of wealth as 3.6 billion people. And it's inequality at an extreme level, not seen since, well, we're not sure if ever, but certainly not seen for 100, 200 more years. And this isn't about being anti-wealth, it's about being anti-poverty. And what the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the World Bank and many others have identified that this extreme inequality is actually preventing development from moving forward. And the link between that and what we're going to talk about this evening is that developing country governments need tax revenues in order to pay for essential services, health, education, social protection. Those are the basics that are required in order to support people to lift themselves out of poverty. And without that, we're going to slide backwards, or certainly we're not going to make progress. And I'll give you, and we've talked at quite length about corporate tax avoidance and evasion and the impact that can have. And our speakers here this evening will demonstrate that more eloquently than I can. But I'll give you just one story, because at the end of the day, it's important to remember that extreme poverty, extreme inequality, and the impact of tax avoidance has a human face. It's not an accounting matter. It's not about statistics or numbers. It's about real people. There's a lady called Monica Kumate from Cameroon in Western Africa, who was pregnant expecting twins. And just leading up to the birth, there were complications. So her family brought her to the nearest hospital. And because Cameroon had introduced fees for entry at hospital level, very low fees, but fees nonetheless, her family couldn't afford to have her admitted. She was on the steps of the hospital where her family were trying to assist her with the birth. The first child was stillborn. The second child died within a few minutes of birth. And Monica Kumate herself died within a few yards of the essential health provision that could have saved her life and probably saved her children. And the reason that the government of Cameroon felt obliged to introduce these fees, there are only 5,000 doctors for the entire population, is that they had to bridge the gap between the tax revenues that they have and the health needs of the population. And so introducing these small fees that essentially were life-affecting, and in this case, 3 lives were lost that could easily have been saved. So there's a real human face on tax avoidance and tax evasion. And so we're going to hear that in more length later on. But what does this mean for Northern Ireland, and why do we want to talk about it here? There's a proposal to cut corporate tax rates, as we know here, and this could happen as early as next year if it was to come about. And we know from our experience in other parts of the world, including down the road, the impact that can have, the inadvertent impact it can have, and the questionable. I think we need to question the element of economic development and prosperity it will bring to Northern Ireland as we've questioned it in the Republic of Ireland. Because what we've seen is that, yes, there may be positive implications in terms of investment, but there's a real concern about all the other things that can come with it if you don't introduce the right kind of safeguards. So we have seen billions of euros being channeled through tax shelters, through brass plate companies, and have been moved to and on elsewhere where their tax is not paid. And you've all read, I'm sure, about the Apple tax ruling, where so much of the revenue of that organisation was channeled through a brass plate company based in Dublin that had no employees, essentially, and it was moved off down to the Caymans or wherever. And there were tax revenues from that lost to developing countries, hundreds of millions. And we say the figure of 100 billion is what's estimated by the UN that's lost in tax revenue to developing countries every year, 100 billion. That is enough to put all of the children that are not currently in school into school, and to possibly save 4 million children's lives every year. So there's a human cost and there's a human implication. And we want to make sure that the debate here in Northern Ireland, we just want to contribute to that debate because it's an important one, it's an important moment. Or it will be when this is being considered in greater detail. We carried out a survey last year of people across Northern Ireland, and 92% of them say the government should ensure that big firms pay their tax revenue. That's not surprising, I suppose. But 89% are concerned that when big companies and wealthy individuals use tax loopholes, which are not available to everybody else, who just pays their PAYE, who just pays their normal tax on their consumption and so on. When they do that, everybody else pays the bill. So there's a real concern about a lack of the potential reduction in tax revenue and the impact it might have, both here at home in Northern Ireland and the impact that vehicles that could be used here will have in developing countries. So that's the framing of our discussion for this evening. As I say, we have a great lineup of really interesting speakers coming at it from various different angles, and I think it'll be very thought-provoking, and we really encourage people to get involved in the discussion, so please do. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. But just again to say thank you all for being here. I hope it's an enjoyable evening. I'm going to hand you over to Yvette Shapiro, who needs no introduction, but an accomplished broadcaster with the UTV and BBC, former business editor of Belfast Telegraph, and I'm sure lots of other areas that I don't even could start describing. But great to have you here, Yvette. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to chair the event. I think it is going to be very interesting that we have a perspective. I was saying to Wanjiru before we start, actually have a perspective from the front line, as opposed to us sitting in the room talking about what the impact of tax avoidance is, tax dodging, tax evasion, however you want to term it. We have somebody who can explain both yourself and Anya, who we'll hear from as well. So let me introduce the panel to you first of all. Starting at the far end, Philip McDonagh, independent economist. Philip, I'm sure you'll have seen over the years many of you popping up in newspapers and television to tell us how the economy is doing well, how the economy is doing badly, and what's going to happen next with the economy. 30 years experience researching and analysing the economy here. He has seen the build-up, the campaign for the lowering of the corporation tax rate. You've probably charted the roller coaster that has been in terms of a political campaign, an economic campaign. and he'll be able to give us some fairly deep insight, I think, into how that, if it ever does come about, how that might actually work on our economy. He's the former chief economist with PwC in Northern Ireland. He has never counted an Oscar vote. He has never ever handed an envelope to Warren Beatty or Faye Dunaway in his life, so we can exclude him from that PricewaterhouseCoopers disaster out there in LA. He is also chair of the Northern Ireland Statistics Advisory Committee. He's board member of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies and a member of the advisory board for the University of Ulster, or Ulster University, Economic Policy Centre. Right beside me, Patricia McKeown. Again, the phrase needs no introduction was invented for Patricia McKeown, probably the best known of our local trade unionists, Regional Secretary of Unison, which is the public service union, and indeed one of the most senior trade unionists on the island of Ireland. Elected member of both the Northern Ireland Committee and the Executive Council of the ICTU. She was president of the ICTU, Irish Congress of Trades, back in 2007, and served at a senior level on many of the committees. She's also a former deputy chair of the Equal Opportunities Commission. Recently appointed worker representative for Ireland on the European Economic and Social Committee. Wanjiru Kanyiha is a trained lawyer and advocate of the High Court of Kenya, involved in various programmes in Inyuka, which means rise up in Kenya. It's an Oxfam partner working on social justice campaigns, looking at good governance, accountability. She would work right across the country in terms of tax justice and really educating people in Kenya about government responsibility and good governance, and trying to encourage people, I suppose, to try and hold the government to account, particularly in terms of corruption and governance. Also sitting with us in the audience and travelling to Ireland, both north and south, Onye Okechukwu. Absolutely. Yay, I got that right. Communications coordinator at ActionAid in Nigeria. Also deeply involved in tax justice campaigns in that country. Also deeply involved in the women's rights movement in Nigeria. And we will, I hope, be calling on you for your own experience of this whole tax issue in Nigeria as we go along. Now, what I'm going to ask the panellists to do, I think I'll just ask each of you a question to kind of, just to lay out really what your position is, what your experience is. Philip, I'd just like to start with you. Could you explain for us, if there is a cut in the rate of corporation tax in Northern Ireland, as has been agreed by the British government when the conditions are right, what do you think would be the impact on our economy in the short to medium term?
Okay. Can I say first of all that I hope you're not disappointed. I'm not a proponent or defender of the proposals for, but I do think they're important, and not important just for Northern Ireland, but I have to congratulate Oxfam for organising this seminar and putting it. What sometimes we see in Northern Ireland, very inward-looking as a purely domestic issue. This is a global issue, as Wanjiru, I'm sure, will tell us more from her perspective. But maybe just to, in terms of the impact, the argument in favour of, although I'm not and never was a proponent of it, the argument for reducing corporation tax in Northern Ireland was basically that what it will do is attract foreign firms from the US and elsewhere into Northern Ireland, and they will create jobs. The initial estimates were around 40,000 new jobs over a period of 20-25 years, and that's since come down a bit, but that was the basic argument. It will create jobs, and the tax collected will actually, even though at a reduced rate, will exceed the amount of tax created at present. So it was really about, and Sir George Quigley, to be fair, who actually came up with this proposal back in, I was looking up, I think it was around 2004 when he first came up with the proposal. It was, and Sir George Quigley was a great thinker and a great reform. Some of the ideas he had were very new and exciting, and did make a difference. But so his proposals were well intentioned and were supported widely by business. We might say, well, so they would be. Any business is going to support lower tax rates. But part of the problem, I think, was that they were originated back in 2004, and it took so long for them to come to fruition that so many other things have happened in the meantime. Particularly very recently with Brexit, well, before that, even Osborne's proposed cuts in UK corporation tax, which were going to make a lower corporation tax rate in Northern Ireland less effective. Then you had Brexit and some uncertainty about, well, how would this affect foreign direct investment into Northern Ireland? Would it be even more important to try to attract foreign firms? And then the election of President Trump and the proposal there that he has been promoting for a reduction to 15% in corporation tax in the US, which and his declared intention to bring all these foreign direct investment, all these American firms in Europe and elsewhere back to the US so they could give jobs to the American workers. That was, in a very brief summary, what his theory is. But all this impacted on what the proposals were for Northern Ireland. In my view, those proposals are now a busted flush. I don't think for Northern Ireland tax rate reduction, they just don't make sense anymore. But what it does do is, I think, it highlights an important debate about what sort of economy and what sort of society we do want in Northern Ireland, and how do we want to fund that society. We have a 10 billion subvention at the present time. That means we pay taxes in Northern Ireland, including corporation tax. We pay taxes of £14 billion per year. Corporation tax is only about 80, less than 100 million of that. Most of it is income tax, VAT, and other taxes. So we pay taxes of 14 million, and public spending comes back into Northern Ireland of 24 billion. So there's a gap, basically, of roughly 10 billion each year. So some people say, well, that's probably about right. The UK government should subsidise Northern Ireland. But I think there's a question or a wider debate that needs to be asked about what sort of society do we want? A more equitable society where tax is shared? Should taxes generally be actually increased to pay for our needs? There's not much we can do about that in Northern Ireland with our limited powers of devolution, and I don't think our former MLAs or executive are too keen on having taxes devolved to them, because it gives them even more difficult decisions than they have at the moment. So that's a bit of a ramble, but answers the question of the basic origins of the.
Does you never ramble, Philip? No. So we've heard Philip's description of how we came to where we are with the corporation tax argument, and as he said, he thinks it's a busted flush because of all these world events and indeed local events that have happened. Patricia McKeown, you have never been, I think, a supporter of the cut in corporation tax. You've been very vocal on that. Just outline for us, why have you always been so opposed? Why do you remain opposed to the cut in corporation tax in Northern Ireland?
It's the position of the whole trade union movement here. We've never been convinced by the arguments of the proponents of reductions in corporation tax. we're one of the few all-island bodies, so we already have the direct experience of 2/3 of our membership in the Republic of Ireland, and Oxfam already ably outlining the fact that we've seen the brass plate companies, we've seen the absence of the job creation that's being predicted, and we've seen the lack of income to the exchequer in the Republic because of this reduction that allowed companies to come in without any kind of genuine regulations about how they might perform and what you might get in return for a tax break. I remember this society when we were handing out tax breaks as a way of actually doing business. I mean, it's not all that many years ago that you got your advanced factory built for you. You were tax-free for a considerable period of time. You were ever taxed, and in came a number of the multinationals, but they only ever stayed for as long as they could milk the system. And when it was appropriate for them, off they would go, leaving in their trail devastation across, wholesale devastation in some instances across communities here, because that was it, that was the end of the work. We are very clear that many of the arguments which were put up at the time wouldn't hold water. I mean, if Singapore had zero corporation tax, why would you come here to pay a reduced rate? We've been very concerned about the whole trend in the casualisation of work, in the impoverishment of workers, about the fact that if we were to reduce corporation taxes here, some considerable work was done on what penalties that would impose on spend on public services, direct public services that are there to basically ensure that we have our fundamental human rights, health, education, housing, etc. And that's not a price we're prepared to pay in the trade union movement. I mean, in terms of tax abuse in general, we have been very vocal about the fact that if the UK HMRC were to go out there and collect what's owed at the minute in avoidance and put that back into the public pot, we would not have been facing the austerity agenda that's been imposed right across the UK and all 4 jurisdictions in respect of frontline public services, and that goes even further into the things that are now popular. Is that the word we use for offensive, racist, bigoted statements? I mean, populism it's called now. This idea that we have to stop spending hard-earned taxed money on other countries in the developing world, for example. So it goes right through the system, and at the end of the day, the corporations find ways of not paying their dues, and that's not acceptable. And we do need decent regulation to make sure that they do pay their dues. Because if you want to live in a decent society, why do we pay taxes? If you want to live in a decent society, you expect decent standards of life on a much more equal basis than we've seen heretofore. And I totally agree with the proposition that we're now living in, right even in our own little local society, the most unequal society that we've experienced. The most recent work on the UK as a whole estimated that we were now in a much more profoundly unequal society than industrial revolution through Victorian times, and I think that is universally true. And yet that's in a world where we have enormous amounts of progress on so many fronts, and where there is great wealth being generated, and that great wealth is not being properly taxed to put it back into a system that would make for a more equal society. And I really do subscribe to the proposition from Wilson and Pickett, for example, in the Spirit Level, that unequal societies are unsafe societies. They, I think, very quickly become undemocratic societies, and we can't afford to ignore that on our own doorstep. We particularly can't afford to ignore it now. I mean, I'm preoccupied at the minute with trying to develop a response to protect this place in our peace agreement, and in particular equality and human rights, which need to be protected as a result of exiting the EU. Locally occupied by convincing people that it would be a good idea to go out and vote on Thursday, but to measure who they will vote for against some basic decent standards in this society, and only vote for people who are prepared to stand up for those decent standards. So you can't, I think, divorce how we treat something like the tax system from the kind of life we want to live and the kind of standards we'd want to see as human beings on planet Earth. And when you realise that very small number of people or corporations are in control of the bulk of the wealth of the planet, and how, if distributed in a better and a fairer way, that could actually change the face of the planet, and it could change the condition for most of humanity, that surely must be the standard we live by. And I mean, it is an intimate part of what being a trade unionist is. It's an intimate part of what the trade union movement stands for. We are collective, but we're not just collective in the workplace. We're collective where we live, and we're collective on the planet.
Okay. Talking about inequality, Wanjiru, you live in Nairobi, in Kenya. You know, nobody better than yourself and colleague Anya to tell us about what the impact is in your country and in other countries of tax avoidance. I mean, we see Kenya. We keep hearing Kenya is becoming a more prosperous country. Its levels of trade, world trade, are increasing. There's a lot of progress economically, but that's not being felt by the sort of communities that you're working with. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely, thank you. As you've rightly put it, Kenya is on the map as an economic powerhouse, not just in East Africa, but in Africa as a whole. So we have a growing GDP, our economy is growing, but at the same time, the wealth is trapped at the top. So there's no trickle-down effect of this wealth, and by wealth I mean resources, down to the people at the bottom. So what you find is a very, as you said, a very unstable society, a very unstable sort of democracy where it's insecure, where the youth particularly are on the edge. They are despondent because they have no decent wages. They have no way of earning a living. So that sort of creates a very unstable environment, and that led to very violent protests and post-election violence in the 2007-2008 elections, and it was mainly a question of inequality, because it was a question of they have and we don't have. So let's go and take from them what we think we deserve, because we also we deserve to live a more dignified life. So that led to a very, very precarious situation in Kenya, where we saw people take arms against each other. So that sort of inequality is quite stark in Nairobi. As I mentioned, the economy is growing, yes, but people are still living in extreme poverty, in deplorable states, mostly in informal settlements, and even outside the city in the 47 counties. So our work, mostly around the tax justice issue, is to create awareness about the real linkage between taxation and the access to essential public services. and it's not an easy task in a country where most people feel completely frustrated with the system as it is, the government structures as they are non-responsive. They are basically felt to be anti the people. So having a conversation with a young man who works in the informal settlement, asking him to pay his fair share, and there's a multinational that comes in, rigs its oil, does all its exploration, and then shifts a huge amount of its profits overseas, it's a very difficult conversation to have. So that's the kind of campaigning we're doing around tax justice, and bringing the real human stories to this conversation. Then when people actually realize that I need to demand for better from my government, then that active citizenship is actually ignited in them. So the inequality is real, it's hurting us, but we are not hopeless, because we are speaking up against it. We are drawing the masses, we are mobilizing them, we are giving them the voice, the platforms to hold their leaders to account, to demand that these multinationals pay their fair share. It's not an easy job to create that quick lineage linkage or the causal effect of it, but it's becoming easier as we start discussing these issues and creating awareness around it.
Philip, how can we get corporations to pay the tax or even something approaching the tax that many believe they should be paying? I mean, it's been company after company after company that we hear are operating, are taking an awful lot of profit out of countries, be it countries in Africa and the developing world, or be it within Ireland, within Northern Ireland, and just not paying tax. How can we change that?
Well, it was great difficulty because I used to work in PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, as you said, Yvette, and there still is a tax department in corporate tax department in PwC, and like the other large accountancy firms, they spend most of their time devising schemes and ways in which their business clients can avoid, as opposed to evade, legally avoid tax, and the result of that is there's relatively very few firms that would pay the full whack. What I would argue, or I think certainly from an economist's point of view, the argument would be that it's the contribution of foreign firms coming into Northern Ireland is less in terms of the tax they pay, as in, well, first of all, the jobs they create. They provide jobs. Okay, Patricia would argue that they only for a limited period of years. Although I think there have been some examples of long-term inward investors in Northern Ireland who've stayed with us and contributed in terms of job creation. They also contribute in terms of skills development. Classic example is Bombardier, which has contributed to the development of the engineering skills and led to other spin-off industries in firms in Northern Ireland. They also contribute to the level of innovation in Northern Ireland, and there's generally perceived to be a beneficial effect. And I know there are arguments as to the extent of this in some cases. How integrated does the company become in Northern Ireland, and how much does it contribute? But that would be the argument, I think, that they contribute in other ways rather than just in tax payments.
Do you have a situation, do you think, Patricia, where there's just is there something lacking in the moral code of these corporations? Because a lot of them make a huge amount about how they are, very integrated with the community, and that they're of the public good, and they've got charitable foundations, and that they feel themselves to be, to be really quite good people and to be good companies. That they're not rapacious. Is there really something? Is there a heart lacking? Is there something gone? Something missing out of the moral code?
Well, the majority of them are anti-trade union. That's the first thing I say. I've always been astounded by the ease with which union busters and anti-trade union firms can come along to both parts of this island and get public money in order to get a tax break. That's the first thing. Now, why would you be anti-trade union unless you were opposed to doing the decent thing by the people who work for you? I have been in rooms where Invest NI, for example, has marketed us as a low-wage economy. And I think that's an utter disgrace. Market us on that basis, then there's another reason, another bad reason why multinationals in particular would want to come here. So that's the exploitation of the people. You have a new president in the US who boasts about not paying taxes. You know, that is absolutely outrageous. If the paying of taxes by those corporations is about genuinely contributing to society, then they ought to pay fair and proper taxes. Nobody's saying that, you know, we're opposed to tax breaks or tax incentives or whatever, but certainly opposed to what's happening at the minute, which is the ability to legally dodge it as well as the evaders. I do think that it is outrageous that ordinary workers, people I represent, will be chased immediately by HMRC if there's an underpayment in terms of their taxes. But if I'm a seriously wealthy corporate entity, I'll get me individual, I forget what we call them. It's kind of like a buddy in HMRC. You buddy up. You buddy up in order to find ways of paying the tax that you owe. And I'm sure in the finding of those ways, because we haven't seen the real collection of that tax yet, we haven't seen the back taxes properly collected, that in that advisory or assistant capacity, loopholes are pointed out. And I don't think there's any place for our government system to be doing that. In fact, there needs to be the introduction of smarter and stronger regulation. I think there's a certain amount you can do domestically, you know, as one government, but there's other stuff you've got to do, you know, across governments, across systems, because if you can actually just, you know, leave one place and do your damnedest in another. I was sitting on the plane looking at the business magazine of BA the other day. 2 different small countries selling citizenship for about $250,000. You can become a citizen of one of these tax havens, and it's worth this $250,000 because then you can salt your earnings away there. And I think that we're even advertising it now. There's something morally wrong.
Well, what would happen if, let's say, from the Millward Brown study that you were quoting from, Jim, before, people responded that they would like to see Theresa May make a priority out of reforming the tax system, tightening it up, making corporations pay. If she was to say, right, I'm charging the Treasury with responsibility for really going after these corporations, and I want a whole new structure to do what Patricia's asked, what would happen in terms of those corporations? Would they flee Britain and go somewhere else because there are concerns that we're going to lose a lot of them because of Brexit anyway, and maybe some of them might want to go back to the United States? What would be the effect on these multinationals if we tried to tighten up on them?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I think there's a certain amount of reputation of a country in terms of how rigorous it is about chasing its corporate taxes, and how I know Patricia would say that there's that the HMRC isn't rigorous enough in chasing firms for their corporation tax. I feel just that the powers that are against them, in terms of said the PwCs and the other accountants who are devising ways to prevent them paying tax, it's almost a game that goes on in terms of HMRC trying to get more tax out of the companies, and the companies and their accountants trying to find ways to avoid doing so. I think it would send out I suppose it depends, going back a step, I suppose it depends how much you believe it's important to have firms from other countries coming into your country and investing and doing things. Is that an important part? Does it actually help economic growth? I'd be interested to know from the Kenyan experience. Can the economy survive without these, or can it grow better without these firms, or do we actually need them in to find some way of getting more tax out of them and getting some of the other benefits that from the firms that?
Do you want to pick that up, Wanjiru? Do you think that Kenya could survive if some of these corporations departed? Perhaps if they were being asked to pay more tax?
Sorry, I'm not an economist, but I'll try and answer it as best as I can. I think we would. Because as it is and the way the economy is growing, it's really being pushed a lot by small to medium-sized enterprises. They're on the rise, but they are also being kept down because of the hurdles and the obstacles they have to set up, basically. So companies have to pay these huge amounts of licensing fees and levies and I don't know what else to operate. But then these huge multinationals are being given these huge tax holidays that go up to even 10 years. So if they were to pull out and this support is given to the mid-sized companies, I think we would survive. We have enough within our economy to grow and to grow these businesses to a place where we are self-sustainable.
And I know your organisation lobbies at a senior level into government in Kenya. What sort of responses do they get? I mean, does the government listen? Does it respond? Does it seem to want to tackle this issue of dealing with big corporations in the way that they should?
To be quite honest, I think our government is quite preoccupied with other things. So we have an election coming up as well. Corruption is, at a grand scale. But when we do have these discussions, I feel their attitude is let's keep them here a bit longer. Let's see what we can get, because they've promised the youth X number of jobs. And in their minds, these jobs will be created by the multinationals. So there is really no shift yet as to getting the multinationals out. And again, it's a two-sided sort of coin, because like one of the largest telcos, whose headquarters I think is the UK, is the largest taxpayer. So I don't know whether that's just a popular phrase or if they're actually paying tax. So they're real bad deals in that sense. So I get the sense that the government's approach is to keep them in as much as they can and for long as they can. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions at this stage, or any comments, any bits of experience they'd like to share? Hand up, okay.
It's just making an observation. Most of the companies we're talking about here are working globally, and I would imagine that they're paying legally the amount of tax they have to pay.
Maybe.
So, if one assumes that they're paying it and they're using legal loopholes, is there then a case for more international regulation? And when I look at the European level, the European Union are very keen to introduce more regulation around taxation at the European level, and yet it's nearly an article of faith of the Irish government to any further involvement of the European Union in setting tax rates. The European Union would be able to do this to wish to prevent tax competition between member states. I was just wondering if the panel, with any view, is this an area that the European Union or other sort of supranational bodies should be involved in to impose some type of basic level of taxation and try to prevent this the competitive tax rates between different countries?
I think it has to be done on an international level. I mean, as I say, there are things we can do on a domestic level. But really, if we're going to talk about proper regulation that isn't avoided in the way it's being avoided at the minute, there has to be a proper global international approach to that. You're right, the EU's talking about it, but what are we going to do? We're going to we're just going to pull out of that one, are you? Yes, that's the real worry we have about what's going to happen in our society. It's not just about the impact on the economy when we pull out of a system of rules. It's about the impact on people and equality and fundamental human rights, and particularly exercised at the minute about how we're going to protect this society and our peace process.
There's a lot of these companies have tremendous political power as well, particularly in developing countries, and they're not beyond influence in elections and destabilising governments when it suits them and see any sort of progressive ideas coming forward. And I think that's a massive problem. If you look at that, their political power is very often not really spoken about.
Anya, could I just bring you in on that question of political power in Nigeria? Do these corporations have a big influence on government, and is their influence on government bigger than the sort of influence that activists and lobbyists can have on government who are trying to persuade the government to collect the taxes they need to collect?
Yeah. Please let me stand up. I think so, because the multinationals are the ones with the money. So money speaks and people listen, and that's how it is with the government. But the truth is, this discussion we are having, I have very clear examples of multinationals, development, and inequality in Nigeria. The problem is these multinationals come in and promise, we will give 40, maybe 500,000 or 2 million jobs. We will help you develop your infrastructure. We will provide water for your community. But those of us who are campaigning and doing analysis of how this affects the communities, we've seen that this, doesn't happen. And in Nigeria, we are trying now to educate the government that, look, you're actually giving away your wealth, thinking you're going to get employment for your people, and they don't. In Nigeria, there are 62% of us. Nigeria is 182 million people, and 62% of that number are living below the poverty line. So what is happening to the oil exploration happening with these big multinationals in the country? So the government are basically not doing the right cost-benefit analysis for them to realize that they are bringing these multinationals and they are promising these huge social amenities that we are not seeing in the lives of the people. Because if they are paying their fair share of tax, then it's left for us activists to now put pressure on our government, because we know that the money is there. But the government is not even receiving this money, because, for example, in Nigeria, just one group of multinationals, 3 companies together, including Shell and Total, in 10 years got a tax holiday that is worth $3.3 billion US. And that is almost twice Nigeria's government budget for education. And in Nigeria, there are 10.5 million children out of school, including, the insecurity issues happening in the Northeast, and more families are scared of taking their children to school. So if just one group of company is costing the government $3.3 billion US, imagine what is happening, with other corporates. So, it's that cost-benefit analysis that I strongly believe that most countries, maybe Northern Ireland as well, who want to reduce taxes for these corporates, they are not doing that properly. Because if you're doing that, you need to genuinely find out how many people are this company actually employing in your country, and that will help you know the kind of tax holiday to give them. But in Nigeria, we've proved that more than 3 times over that the foreign direct investment promise does not necessarily translate into better lives or better jobs for people. So that is what we need to think about.
Thank you. Very good example. I mean, Philip, you said right at the start that the basic premise, the whole foundation upon which the corporation tax reduction campaign was built here is now probably null and void because of other things that have happened that were perhaps unexpected, like Brexit. But if a new government, once it is elected and finally devolution is up and running again, if they want to proceed with this corporation tax cut, how would people benefit? For example, the sort of people that Patricia represents, low-paid workers within the public sector. How do you convince someone like that a corporation tax cut? We keep hearing this phrase, it's going to be the tide that lifts all boats. But if you're a low-paid worker in the health service, for example, how do you benefit? How does your family benefit from this? You're not going to get one of these jobs because you're a hospital porter or you work in some element of the health service. So how do you convince people that it can?
It's one of the weaknesses of the argument for reduced corporation tax in Northern Ireland is that it's got the promise of creating all these 20,000, 30,000 jobs. But what type of jobs are they? And are they jobs that people in Northern Ireland can access and are trained to take up? So the argument there would be that, well, what you have to do is you have to have a corporation tax reduction, but in parallel with that, you need proper training and skills development of people in Northern Ireland so that they are in a position to take up some of the jobs that are on offer, and that it allows people to move out of lower paid jobs into some of the theoretically better paid jobs, because Invest NI has, which is the Industrial Development Promotion Agency in Northern Ireland, has said what their target in foreign direct investment is to bring in companies who are going to pay jobs which are above the average wage. So in order to do that, you need to have people who are in the position to take up some of these jobs. So that would be the argument that would need to be put forward by anyone wanting to keep the proposal going.
Do you agree that we have what business leaders and some politicians keep referring to as a bloated public sector in Northern Ireland? I mean, that phrase, bloated public sector, has just slipped into the lexicon as if it is a fact. Is it a fact?
I don't think so. I think we've probably an average size public sector. The problem is we have a very tiny private sector. And I would also say there's a lot of, actually it's very interesting because one of the things that economists always talk about and nobody else understands is productivity and the importance of productivity. And in Northern Ireland we have a very low rate of productivity, which is is not good for economic growth. But actually, if you look at the public sector, it's actually one of the highest rates of productivity. So our problem is not in the public sector; it's in the small size, I would argue, of the private sector. Where we do have a problem is that we've had this large public sector relative to our private sector it developed during the period of the Troubles. And when the Troubles was over, it was all going to be boom, we were going to grow our private sector, the conditions were right, and it didn't happen. So our problem is, how do we grow this public sector, the small private sector, create more jobs there? And understandably, I think some people came up with the idea of the lower corporation tax as being a way of doing that. Now, in my view, it was too simplistic, that it wasn't going to solve everything overnight anyway. But that would be the argument, that it's our private sector that we need to grow.
There is, of course, a lazy way of doing that, which is where this mantra about too big a public sector comes from. And that is just privatise the public sector jobs and pretend that you have grown the private sector. And, there was a big push in the late 80s, 90s around areas like health and education. I'm very pleased to say we pushed it all back eventually. But it is the lazy way. One of the things I've been involved for many years in different forms of economic forums with business, trade unions, farming sector, departments, etc. We've never achieved any of the visions like improving the skills base. But, we've talked about it. That was the vision for 2010. This is 2017. Got nowhere near that vision. All sorts of good plans over the years, but never followed through. Now, you could say some of that is about unstable government, and I'd say that probably has played a very significant role in it all, but not enough work is done here to go behind the soundbite and see what's true and what's not true. We now know that we've got the smallest proportionate workforce in the health service between us, England, Scotland and Wales, and that's because for quite a number of years they counted in social services and social care workforce because we've an integrated system. But they compared us to a health system in England, Scotland and Wales. They didn't deliver that. Local authorities delivered that. So, the basis was wrong, and we know it's smaller than it should be now. But you've got to spend a lot of time on picking, getting into the real substance of it and saying, well, that statement's being made. Is that statement true or not? Let's get underneath that and see what reality really looks like.
Jim, I'm going to ask you, because I'm very conscious of time, because we have a couple of people in Wanjiru and Anya need to be on the road to Dublin, on the train to Dublin, I think, this evening. So, lest you should miss your train, I'm going to ask Jim Clarken, please, just to sum up and say a final word.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks to all of our panel and to you. It's been a really an interesting evening. I suppose just rather than to try and sum up, because it would be impossible, there's a couple of reflections and a couple of things that I think are worth considering, because this is a dialogue that's going to continue, and I think it's one that we need to be having. I suppose, countries do benefit or can benefit from FDI, from investment into the country, and it can be a key lever at economic growth, at key moments in economic development. So, what we're not trying to absolutely put that off the agenda or try to dissuade that, but try to make sure that corporations behave responsibly. From a workers' rights perspective, from a paying their fair share perspective, from a treatment of resources perspective. And worth remembering that those companies rely on the infrastructure, on the education, on the health services, on the housing, on the roads, all those things that everybody pays for. So it is right and proper that they contribute to that. It is also fine for them to make a profit. Nobody's against that. It's fine for them to develop. It's also in their self-interest for developing countries to move to the next stage of development, where they would create new markets for their products and services. And you've seen this particularly in the telecom side. Africa will be a bigger consumer of telecoms than the US soon. So there is an interest there, but corporations have to see that they have a responsibility to behave in a way that reflects that. There was a question asked earlier about how, I think it was over here actually, how the jurisdiction in relation to tax codes and so on. We've been calling for a UN body to look to work together with all countries in relation to this, because the EU, or outside the EU as the test is going to be, won't do it alone. And we've been involved in lobbying around the OECD BEPS process, which some might be familiar with, which is the base erosion and profit shifting kind of exercise that the OECD countries are going on. But that doesn't include the vast majority of the population of the world. It only includes those wealthy countries. So this has to be done at a global level. It has to be done at a UN level. And one of the key asks that we want to have of this campaign is to get to a point where there's sufficient momentum to gather together a global body. And the G77 and others are asking for that. And there's momentum going. And it's quite interesting. A narrative that might have seemed ridiculous or unsavory to the broader establishment, if you like, suddenly starts to gather momentum. I mean, we couldn't have had this tax discussion on the island of Ireland 5 years ago because people are so sensitive about frightening off the multinationals. Multinationals are here to make a profit. They're here because they see the market, the access to the EU or the access to the UK market or the access to the markets. They see the benefit of the societies that we have created. They see the security, they see the stability, they see the talent, they see all those good things that are here. They're not there for the good of their health, but they have to be seen to contribute in a way that makes sense for them. And this fear that unless we tackle this at a global level, there will be a consistent race to the bottom. We will be competing with, and here in Northern Ireland, you could be competing with a country in an African country, for example, or a Southeast Asian country, to shift resources around, which doesn't benefit anybody. So we have to start changing that narrative. But there are interesting discussions happening, and we're allowed to talk about this, and we're talking about this. Just a comparison that I'd make is nobody talked about climate change until about 15 years ago. It wasn't even in the lexicon. And if you don't believe that these things are possible, you get a major agreement in Paris a year and a half ago. Now, delivering it is a whole other thing, but at least that has happened. So we, as people who care about these issues, everybody in this room coming from different spaces, need to have the courage to be able to speak out about them and to challenge some of the perceived wisdom on this, but also to say, look, there are lots of benefits in here, there are wins in here for everyone if we get it right. But let's make sure we continue that dialogue.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you have any questions about anything you've heard in the podcast, drop us an email at belfasticonoclast@gmail.com or send a message on our Facebook page, facebook.com/BelfastIconoclast. Of course, you can also tweet us at BeFastIconoclast. Thanks very much for listening.